Hey there, brave souls! Tonight we're diving headfirst into one of history's most spectacularly dysfunctional periods, where simply existing was basically a criminal offence, and every morning brought fresh opportunities to accidentally break laws you didn't know existed. You know the drill, so before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me dissect humanity's most absurd moments. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me from around the world to witness this particular brand of historical chaos. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what we're about to explore isn't just medieval history, it's a masterclass in how societies can transform everyday life into an elaborate punishment theatre where logic went to die and common sense was buried in an unmarked grave. Picture this. You wake up in a typical medieval town, stretch your arms, and immediately commit 3 crimes before your feet hit the floor. You smiled without proper authorization. You stretched too enthusiastically, suggesting dangerous levels of personal satisfaction. And you failed to immediately prostrate yourself before the imaginary portrait of your lord that definitely should have been hanging in your hovel, but obviously wasn't because you're poor. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where existence itself was essentially a crime waiting to be prosecuted, and every single aspect of human behaviour was regulated by laws that seemed designed by someone who had clearly never experienced joy, logic, or basic human decency. This is the story of 5 unfortunate souls navigating a world where happiness was suspicious, bread was a weapon of civic destruction, and even your clothes could land you in stocks for crimes against fashion. Meet Gundrick, the cheerfully doomed tailor, Marjorie, the dangerously clean washerwoman, Pierre, the perpetually punished baker, Lisbeth, the fashion criminal peasant, and Brother Hubert, the emotionally regulated monk. These aren't heroes, they're survivors, and barely that. Let's start with the fundamental problem. In medieval Europe, simply being alive and occasionally happy about it was viewed as morally questionable. The authorities had created a system so comprehensively oppressive that breathing incorrectly could result in public humiliation, and God forbid you should accidentally whistle while working. That was practically sedition. Gundrick learned this the hard way on a Tuesday morning that started normally and ended with him carrying a 30-pound sack of flour across the town square while children threw mud at his face. His crime? Walking through the marketplace with what the inspector described as excessive cheerfulness and a demeanour suggesting improper satisfaction with life. The inspector, a pale man whose job satisfaction seemed to derive entirely from other people's misery, emerged from whatever shadow he'd been lurking in and fixed Gundrick with the kind of stare usually reserved for people caught stealing communion wine. "That smile," he declared, pointing at Gundrick's face like he'd discovered evidence of witchcraft. "Morally suspect. Pay the fine." Gundrick tried to explain that he was simply having a decent day, which turned out to be exactly the wrong thing to say. Apparently having decent days without proper authorization was also illegal. Who knew? The punishment was immediate and theatrical. Gundrick was forced to carry that flour sack across the entire square, stopping every 3 steps to bow deeply to the magistrate, while a crowd of children and apprentices gathered to throw mud and rotting vegetables with the enthusiasm of people who'd finally found legitimate entertainment. The town square transformed into a bizarre theatre of punishment, where the main attraction was watching a cheerful tailor slowly realise that optimism was apparently a luxury he couldn't afford. A wandering minstrel, clearly not getting the memo about the town's anti-joy policies, attempted to sing an encouraging song for poor Gundrick. This immediately resulted in the minstrel being fined for encouraging dangerous emotional states through unauthorized music. Because in medieval towns, music that made people feel better was considered a public menace. Joy, you see, was dangerous. It made people think they deserved things like dignity, fair treatment, or basic human rights. Can't have that. But Gundrick's cheerfulness crisis was just the appetizer. The real feast of absurdity was happening at the bakery, where bread had somehow become the most legally complicated substance in existence. Pierre the baker discovered this when his loaf turned out slightly larger than the precise specifications demanded by law. Not by much. We're talking maybe an inch of extra bread. But in medieval bureaucracy, an inch might as well have been a mile of pure criminality. The bread inspector, a man whose entire career was built on measuring loaves and finding fault with them, arrived at Pierre's shop with the grim efficiency of someone who genuinely believed that improper bread dimensions posed a threat to civilized society. "Oversized loaf," he announced, making notes on a piece of parchment like he was documenting evidence of treason. "This constitutes theft of grain, unauthorized expansion of food products, and showing off, with bread." Pierre was immediately sentenced to parade his criminal loaf through the town square, while carrying a bucket of rotten vegetables that townspeople could grab and throw. The logic here was that public humiliation would serve as a deterrent to other bakers who might be considering similar acts of bread-based rebellion. Halfway across the square, Pierre slipped in a puddle of tomato pulp, left over from someone else's punishment parade. The loaf went flying, landing in the town fountain with a splash that soaked several nearby spectators. His apprentice Lucien, trying to be helpful, rushed to catch the runaway bread and promptly tripped over the magistrate's ceremonial chair, sending the whole thing crashing to the cobblestones. The magistrate, now wet, angry and covered in fountain water mixed with breadcrumbs, declared this a moral lesson for all, and ordered Pierre to scrub the fountain stones while balancing the soggy loaf on his head. Because apparently, the best way to teach someone about proper bread dimensions was to make them perform physical comedy while drenched and humiliated. Meanwhile, at the other end of the square, Claude the baker was discovering that making bread too small was equally criminal. His attempt to save flour by baking modest loaves had resulted in charges of criminally skimpy bread production and defrauding customers through insufficient carbohydrates. Claude found himself wearing a sign reading, "I commit loaf crimes," while children chanted, "Too small! Too small!" with the rhythmic enthusiasm of a mob calling for execution. When Pierre's wayward bread splashed fountain water onto Claude's humiliation parade, the two bread disasters collided in a cascade of mud, water and public shame that had the crowd cheering like they were watching gladiators fight to the death. But the true genius of medieval bread law revealed itself through Henri, who had committed the most dangerous crime of all. He had baked a perfect loaf. The inspector took one look at Henri's flawless bread, with its ideal crust and perfect proportions, and immediately grew suspicious. "Too perfect," he declared. "Morally questionable. No honest baker creates bread this good without supernatural assistance or dangerous pride." Henri was forced to kneel on the cobblestones for an hour while children threw mild vegetables and pigeons, apparently recruited by the authorities for aerial punishment support, bombarded him from the rooftops. His perfect loaf was ceremonially burned as a lesson about the dangers of excellence. The message was clear. Bad bread was illegal. Good bread was illegal. Perfect bread was definitely illegal. The only safe bread was apparently bread that existed in some impossible middle ground that no baker had ever successfully achieved. And this was just the bread situation. Fashion law was equally insane. Every piece of clothing was regulated down to the thread count, and peasants who dared to wear anything that suggested they might have self-respect or basic human dignity faced immediate consequences. Johann learned this when his hat was measured, and found to be exactly 1 inch taller than regulations permitted. 1 inch. The hat inspector, a man whose job was apparently to walk around measuring headwear with the dedication of a scientist studying dangerous specimens, confiscated the offending hat and sentenced Johann to stand on a wooden platform as a human signboard. For 6 hours, Johann stood there while children jumped around throwing mud and pigeons used his hatless head as a convenient perching spot. Every 10 seconds, he was required to bow deeply to any passing nobles, which was particularly challenging when pigeons were involved. The crowd found this endlessly entertaining, placing bets on how long Johann could maintain his balance while dodging projectiles and performing mandatory genuflections. Medieval entertainment was apparently just watching people suffer for minor infractions, while birds pooped on them. But Johann's hat crisis was nothing compared to Lisbeth's scarf situation. Lisbeth had committed the unforgivable sin of wearing a scarf that contained the faintest hint of purple. Not bright purple, not royal purple. We're talking about a scarf that had once been white but had accidentally picked up the slightest lavender tint from being washed in the same basin as some berries. You had to squint in direct sunlight to even notice the colour, but the fashion inspector had the keen eye of a hawk and the moral flexibility of a particularly vindictive snake. "Purple," he announced, as if he'd discovered evidence of witchcraft woven into the fabric itself. "Unauthorized colour display. Suggests aspirations above station. Indicates dangerous levels of personal taste." Lisbeth tried to explain that it was an accident, that she had no intention of wearing purple anything, that she was just trying to keep her neck warm. This only made things worse. Apparently, claiming innocence in fashion crimes was considered additional evidence of guilt, because only someone truly corrupt would try to deny their obvious colour criminality. The sentence was swift and theatrical. Lisbeth was forced to scrub the streets while wearing a bright red cloak labelled colour criminal in large, embarrassing letters. The irony of punishing unauthorised purple by mandating bright red was apparently lost on everyone except Lisbeth, who spent her scrubbing hours contemplating the twisted logic of medieval justice. Villagers lined up to mock her, chanting absurd songs about the evils of fashion and the moral dangers of accidentally attractive clothing. Some creative children composed a little ditty that went, purple scarf, leads to sin and moral bath, which they sang with the enthusiasm usually reserved for religious holidays. The situation escalated when Pierre's bread disaster sent a wave of muddy fountain water cascading across the square, soaking Lisbeth's punishment cloak and adding an extra layer of humiliation to her street-scrubbing duties. Now she was wet, muddy, publicly shamed, and still technically guilty of unauthorised colour possession. But fashion law had more surprises in store. Margot discovered that wearing 3 rings instead of the legally mandated maximum of 2 was apparently a crime against social order. The jewellery inspector, whose job was to count accessories and find fault with them, spotted the extra ring from across the square with the precision of someone whose entire sense of purpose depended on finding minor infractions. 3 rings, he announced as if he'd uncovered a conspiracy against the crown. Excessive ornamentation suggests wealth above station, indicates possible theft or moral corruption. Margot's punishment involved delivering a public apology in front of a carefully assembled audience of livestock and children. She had to stand before a crowd of cows, pigs, goats, and assorted farm animals while explaining her jewellery crimes and promising to never again wear more than 2 rings simultaneously. The children were encouraged to ask questions during this bovine court session, which led to surreal exchanges like, "Why did you think 3 rings were acceptable? And do you understand how your excessive jewellery threatened the moral fabric of our community?" To add insult to injury, pigeons were deliberately placed on her lap during the apology session, where they proceeded to defecate rhythmically as what the magistrate called a natural test of humility. Because apparently even birds were recruited into the medieval justice system. The message was becoming clear. In this town, every aspect of personal presentation was a potential crime, and the punishments were designed not just to correct behaviour, but to provide entertainment for bored townspeople who had apparently never seen anything more exciting than watching their neighbours get publicly humiliated for minor fashion infractions. Meanwhile, Marjorie the washerwoman was discovering that cleanliness, far from being next to godliness, was actually next to criminality. Her crime was simple. She had washed her clothes twice in 1 week. This was deemed excessive hygiene and suspicious cleanliness that suggests moral vanity. The hygiene inspector, a man who apparently made his living by monitoring how often people bathed and finding fault with their cleaning habits, had been watching Marjorie's laundry routine with the dedication of a scholar studying ancient texts. "No honest person needs to wash clothing this frequently," he declared. "Clean clothes suggest pride, vanity, and possible supernatural assistance. Also, you're making the rest of us look bad." Marjorie was sentenced to wear visibly dirty garments for a week while scrubbing the public streets. The irony of forcing someone to clean streets while wearing dirty clothes as punishment for being too clean was apparently another example of medieval logic at its finest. Children were encouraged to throw mud at her during her cleaning duties, which created the surreal situation of someone trying to clean streets while simultaneously being covered in mud by order of the law. Her husband, wisely, fled to the woods rather than risk being charged as an accessory to excessive cleanliness. But the hygiene laws had an even stranger twist. While Marjorie was being punished for being too clean, other citizens were being fined for being too dirty. The hygiene inspector roamed the streets looking for people whose clothes were insufficiently clean, creating a narrow band of acceptable dirtiness that nobody could successfully navigate. Citizens found themselves frantically trying to achieve the perfect level of grubbiness, dirty enough to avoid charges of vanity, but clean enough to avoid charges of slovenliness. It was an impossible standard that guaranteed everyone would eventually be punished for something. The situation reached peak absurdity when neighbouring villagers, trying to avoid getting splashed during Marjorie's mud-throwing punishment, accidentally interfered with the proceedings and were immediately fined for disrupting civic correction. Even trying to stay clean during someone else's hygiene punishment was apparently illegal. As if the human justice system wasn't complicated enough, the town had also developed an elaborate legal framework for trying animals. Animals, you see, were considered fully responsible legal actors capable of committing crimes and deserving punishment. Pigs could be charged with accidental murder if they stepped on someone's foot too hard. Roosters could be prosecuted for crowing at inappropriate hours. Rats could face formal charges for stealing cheese, complete with trials, witnesses, and legal representation. The pig versus priest incident became the stuff of local legend. A pig had accidentally stepped on a priest's foot during a religious procession, causing minor injury and major theological confusion. Was this an accident? Was it deliberate assault? Was it a sign from God or an attack by Satan? After extensive deliberation involving witnesses, character testimony, and examination of the pig's previous behaviour, the animal was found guilty of assault against a religious official and sentenced to execution. The pig's owner was forced to parade barefoot through town as punishment for failing to properly control his livestock. Children gathered to parade the pig's corpse through the streets afterward, while the magistrate declared moral instruction complete and filed the appropriate paperwork for successful animal prosecution. The rooster trials were equally elaborate. When a rooster crowed at the wrong hour, disrupting sleep and potentially interfering with religious observances, it faced charges of disturbing the peace and showing disrespect for proper time management. The bird was chained to a barn as punishment, while its owner received fines for failing to teach proper crowing etiquette. Witnesses testified about the rooster's previous crowing behaviour. An expert opinion was sought on whether the incorrect crowing indicated malicious intent or mere stupidity. Even rats weren't exempt from legal proceedings. When rats were caught stealing cheese from the market, they faced formal trials complete with tiny defendant stands and miniature legal documents. The rats were usually found guilty, sentenced to death, and given elaborate public funerals that children attended like festivals. The rat funerals became major social events, with eulogies praising the deceased rodents' criminal careers and warnings to other rats about the consequences of cheese theft. Children would throw confetti and cheer, "Justice is served," while their parents placed bets on which rat would be the next to face legal proceedings. But perhaps the most bewildering aspect of medieval law was its enthusiastic embrace of retroactive justice. Laws could be passed on Tuesday and applied to actions taken the previous Monday. Bread that was perfectly legal when baked could become criminal evidence if regulations changed between baking and eating. Clothes that were acceptable yesterday could result in punishment today if fashion laws were updated overnight. The retroactive bread cases became particularly infamous. A baker could follow every regulation perfectly, produce legally compliant loaves, sell them to satisfied customers, and then face charges the next day when the bread specifications were retroactively modified. Pierre experienced this firsthand when his Monday loaves, which had been inspected and approved, were declared illegal on Tuesday due to new regulations about crust thickness. He was forced to parade through town carrying examples of his now criminal bread, while children threw tomatoes and chanted about the dangers of retroactive carbohydrates. The retroactive fashion laws were equally confusing. Shoes worn last month could suddenly become evidence of crimes against proper footwear. Hats purchased in good faith could retroactively violate regulations that didn't exist when they were bought. Citizens found themselves constantly worried about their past choices, knowing that yesterday's perfectly legal decisions could become today's criminal evidence. People started keeping detailed records of their clothing choices, meal preparations, and daily activities, hoping to prove their innocence when retroactive laws inevitably caught up with them. The most surreal retroactive case involved smiles. A law was passed declaring that any smiles given on the previous 2 Sundays were retroactively inappropriate and subject to fines. Citizens who had smiled in church, at their children, or even at passing dogs found themselves facing charges for unauthorized facial expressions that had occurred in the past. Brother Hubert, already suffering through his bucket of tears punishment for present-day infractions, was additionally charged with retroactive smiling during a prayer service from the previous month. His punishment was extended to include apologizing to the congregation for his past happiness, while simultaneously crying on command for his current offences. The town square had become a swirling maelstrom of overlapping punishments, where past, present, and future crimes collided in a spectacular display of bureaucratic creativity. By mid-afternoon, the town square resembled a theatrical production directed by someone who had clearly suffered a severe head injury while studying law books. Every citizen was trapped in multiple overlapping punishments that created a feedback loop of escalating absurdity, where each attempt to comply with one regulation inevitably violated 17 others. Pierre, still struggling with his oversized loaf disaster, discovered that his bread problems had multiplied like rabbits in springtime. The retroactive bread laws had kicked in with vengeance, declaring that not only was his current loaf illegal, but every loaf he'd baked in the past month was now considered evidence of a criminal conspiracy against proper carbohydrate distribution. The bread inspector, drunk on his own authority and possibly actual alcohol, had decided that Pierre's consistent ability to bake edible bread suggested supernatural assistance or dangerous competence. Either way, it was clearly suspicious and required immediate intervention. "No honest baker," the inspector declared while reviewing Pierre's bread history with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient prophecies, "produces this many successful loaves without demonic guidance or excessive pride. Your bread crimes span weeks, possibly months. This suggests premeditation." Pierre tried to explain that baking bread was literally his job, that producing edible loaves was generally considered the point of being a baker. This defense was immediately rejected as evidence of additional guilt, because only someone truly corrupt would try to justify their bread crimes with logic. The punishment escalated accordingly. Pierre was now required to carry not just his current oversized loaf, but representative samples of his retroactively criminal bread from the past month. He staggered through the square looking like a mobile bakery of shame, weighed down by enough illegal bread to feed a small army of very hungry lawyers. Children followed him in a parade, singing improvised songs about the dangers of competent baking, while pelting him with flour and yesterday's vegetables. The more he stumbled under his bread burden, the more the crowd cheered, because watching someone struggle with the weight of their own competence was apparently the height of medieval entertainment. But Pierre's bread catastrophe was just one thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of punishment that was engulfing the entire town. Lisbeth, meanwhile, had discovered that her purple scarf situation had evolved into something far more sinister. The fashion inspector had decided that her scarf was not just accidentally purple, but intentionally designed to mock the colour restrictions that kept society functioning properly. "This scarf," he announced while examining the offending fabric with a magnifying lens borrowed from someone who probably needed it for actual important work, "shows evidence of deliberate colour manipulation. The purple didn't just happen, it was cultivated, nurtured, encouraged to develop into full criminality." Elizabeth's protest that she had no idea how to intentionally create purple in fabric only made things worse. Claiming ignorance about colour theory was apparently additional evidence of guilt, because obviously only someone with extensive knowledge of illegal dyeing techniques would pretend not to understand how colours worked. Her street scrubbing punishment was expanded to include wearing a sign that read, "Colour Conspirator," while balancing a bucket of regulation-approved grey water on her head. Every time she spilled even a drop, children were authorised to throw mud at her while chanting approved anti-fashion slogans. The situation became even more surreal when Lisbeth's scrubbing duties intersected with Pierre's bread parade. As he staggered past under his load of criminal carbohydrates, flour from his illegal loaves dusted onto Lisbeth's wet cloak, creating what the fashion inspector immediately declared to be unauthorised textile modification through bread contamination. This triggered a whole new set of punishments involving both the fashion and food inspectors working together to determine whether flour-dusted fabric constituted a fashion crime, a bread crime, or some entirely new category of offence that would require additional paperwork and creative sentencing. Meanwhile, Marjorie's cleanliness crimes had attracted the attention of the hygiene inspector's assistant, a young man whose enthusiasm for finding fault with people's washing habits bordered on the pathological. He had been studying Marjorie's punishment routine with the dedication of a student preparing for final examinations, taking notes on her scrubbing technique and timing her mud-dodging reflexes. "She's too good at avoiding the mud," he reported to his supervisor with the tone of someone who had discovered evidence of witchcraft. "Normal people can't dodge projectiles while scrubbing streets. This suggests supernatural cleanliness abilities or dangerous competence at hygiene management." The assistant's observations led to a new category of punishment: excessive skill at being punished. Marjorie was now required to scrub streets less efficiently, to take direct hits from a certain percentage of thrown mud, and to demonstrate appropriate levels of suffering while performing her cleaning duties. This created the bizarre spectacle of someone being coached on how to be worse at their punishment, with inspectors shouting helpful advice like, "Stumble more and show proper humiliation," while children kept score on whether Marjorie was meeting her mandatory suffering quotas. The situation reached new heights of absurdity when Marjorie accidentally scrubbed a section of street too clean, revealing cobblestones that hadn't been visible in years. The hygiene inspector immediately declared this unauthorized urban improvement and showing off during punishment, which resulted in additional penalties for making the town look better while being publicly humiliated. Brother Hubert, still trapped in his bucket of tears marathon, had become the unwilling centerpiece of what was evolving into a town-wide emotional regulation experiment. The religious inspector had decided that Hubert's crying, while mandatory, was not sufficiently sincere and needed to be enhanced through additional trauma. "Those tears look suspicious," the inspector announced while examining Hubert's bucket contents, with the expertise of someone who had apparently made a career out of evaluating the authenticity of forced weeping. "They're too watery. Real penitent tears have more salt, more genuine suffering. These look like amateur tears from someone who's just going through the motions." Hubert tried to explain that he was crying as hard as he could while balancing buckets and dodging pigeons. But this only convinced the inspector that additional motivation was needed. The punishment was expanded to include having children read him detailed accounts of his various infractions while he wept, creating a feedback loop where his crying about being forced to cry became evidence that he wasn't crying hard enough about his original crimes. The emotional complexity of being punished for insufficient suffering while suffering through punishment for crimes he didn't remember committing was apparently lost on everyone except Hubert, who was developing what might charitably be called philosophical insights about the nature of circular logic and bureaucratic creativity. Joran the tailor, meanwhile, was discovering that his sleep deprivation sentence had evolved into something resembling a medieval psychology experiment. The sleep inspector had decided that simply keeping Joran awake wasn't sufficient. His exhaustion needed to be managed and optimized to ensure maximum educational value. "He's hallucinating, but not constructively," the inspector noted while watching Joran stumble around the square, talking to imaginary bread loaves and apologizing to non-existent fashion inspectors. "These hallucinations don't teach proper lessons about the dangers of excessive tailoring competence. We need better hallucinations." This led to the surreal situation of inspectors trying to guide Joran's sleep-deprived visions toward more morally instructive content. They would shout suggestions like, "See the dangers of perfect stitching," and "Imagine the consequences of well-fitted garments," while Joran wandered around having conversations with furniture and occasionally attempting to sew clouds together. The educational value of these guided hallucinations was questionable, but they provided excellent entertainment for the growing crowd of spectators who had apparently decided that watching someone lose their grip on reality was better than anything currently playing at the local theatre. Young Ansel, the perpetually unlucky boy, had become something of a celebrity in his own right. His sign declaring him bad luck in motion had attracted a following of children who trailed behind him waiting for his next inevitable accident. They had started placing bets on what would go wrong next, turning Ansel's misfortune into a primitive gambling operation. The luck inspector, a position that definitely shouldn't have existed but somehow did, had determined that Ansel's bad luck was too consistent to be natural. "Normal bad luck," he declared, with the authority of someone who had apparently studied accident patterns extensively, "is more random. This boy's misfortune follows suspicious patterns that suggest either supernatural intervention or deliberate incompetence." Ansel tried to point out that he wasn't choosing to have bad luck, that accidents just seemed to happen around him, but this was immediately classified as additional evidence of guilt. Only someone truly dangerous would try to claim that their consistently disastrous impact on their surroundings was unintentional. The punishment for suspicious bad luck involved Ansel being required to demonstrate his accidents on command. Inspectors would point to various objects and demand that he accidentally break them, trip over them, or somehow cause them to malfunction through his presence alone. This created the philosophically confusing situation of someone being punished for accidents by being forced to have accidents deliberately, which somehow made the accidents less accidental but more punishable, according to logic that existed only in the minds of medieval bureaucrats who had clearly spent too much time thinking about the legal implications of misfortune. As the afternoon wore on, the various punishment parades began intersecting and overlapping in ways that created entirely new categories of chaos. Pierre's bread procession collided with Lisbeth's scrubbing route, sending flour and muddy water cascading across the square in a spectacular display of culinary and fashion law enforcement gone wrong. Marjorie, trying to dodge the flour explosion while maintaining her mandatory suffering levels, accidentally bumped into Joran, who was at that moment having a particularly vivid hallucination about being chased by a giant thimble. The collision sent both of them sprawling into Hubert's tear collection area, where they proceeded to contaminate his buckets with street mud and existential confusion. The inspectors, faced with this unprecedented convergence of punishment violations, huddled together like generals planning a military campaign. They consulted their regulations, cross-referenced their procedures, and eventually announced a series of additional penalties for unauthorized punishment interference, contamination of official suffering, and disrupting civic education through accidental chaos. Ansel, meanwhile, had managed to trip over his own bad luck sign and fall into the fountain, which was immediately declared evidence of malicious water disruption and showing off during misfortune demonstration. The fact that he was now soaking wet and shivering was classified as an improvement to his punishment rather than an unfortunate accident. The crowd of spectators had grown substantially, with people arriving from neighbouring villages after hearing reports of the most comprehensively absurd day of punishment in recent memory. Vendors appeared selling snacks and beverages to the audience, because nothing enhanced the experience of watching your neighbours suffer, like having something to munch on during the performance. Children had organised themselves into cheering sections, with different groups supporting their favourite punishment victims. Team Pierre chanted bread-related encouragement, while Team Lisbeth developed elaborate songs about the moral dangers of unauthorised colours. Team Marjorie focused on cleanliness-themed mockery, while Team Hubert composed surprisingly sophisticated theological arguments about the relationship between tears and salvation. The pigeons, not to be outdone by human organisational efforts, had apparently formed their own punishment support network. They coordinated their aerial bombardments with military precision, taking turns delivering strategic deposits onto various victims while maintaining what looked suspiciously like formation flying. Some observers swore that the lead pigeon was wearing a tiny inspector's badge, though this was probably just mass hallucination brought on by exposure to too much concentrated absurdity in a single afternoon. As evening approached, the magistrates realised they had created something unprecedented in the history of municipal punishment. What had started as routine law enforcement had evolved into a kind of performance art where the boundaries between justice, entertainment, and experimental psychology had completely dissolved. The town square was no longer just a place where people were punished for crimes. It had become a living laboratory for testing the limits of human tolerance, for bureaucratic creativity and officially sanctioned suffering. And tomorrow they would wake up and do it all again, because in medieval towns the only thing more consistent than the absurdity of the laws was the dedication of the officials who enforced them with the enthusiasm of people who had found their true calling in life. Calling in life. The truly magnificent thing about medieval law enforcement was how it managed to create new problems faster than it solved old ones. By evening, what had started as simple bread regulation had evolved into something resembling a town-wide experiment in applied chaos theory, where every solution generated 3 new crises and every punishment spawned additional opportunities for creative suffering. The magistrates, drunk on their own authority and possibly actual wine, decided that the day's events had revealed disturbing patterns of coordinated criminality that required immediate investigation. The fact that Pierre's bread had collided with Lisbeth's purple scarf while Marjorie dodged mud, and Joran hallucinated about giant thimbles was clearly not coincidental. This was obviously a conspiracy. No group of citizens, declared the chief magistrate while reviewing the day's incident reports with the intensity of a scholar decoding ancient prophecies, accidentally creates this level of coordinated chaos without supernatural assistance or deliberate planning. These overlapping crimes suggest organised resistance to proper civic order. The conspiracy theory gained momentum when someone pointed out that all 5 main offenders had been in the town square simultaneously, which was immediately classified as evidence of suspicious coordination and unlawful assembly during punishment. The fact that they had been forced to be there by the authorities was apparently irrelevant to this line of reasoning. A new inspector was appointed on the spot, the conspiracy detection specialist, whose job was to identify patterns of coordinated criminality among citizens who had previously been considered individually problematic, but were now suspected of being part of a larger network of civic disruption. The conspiracy inspector began his investigation by examining the physical evidence of the day's chaos. Pierre's flour had contaminated Lisbeth's cloak, which had then transferred mud to Marjorie's buckets, which had splashed onto Hubert's tears, which had somehow ended up on Joran's hallucination-addled clothing. This chain of contamination was immediately declared proof of intentional evidence mixing and collaborative punishment avoidance. The fact that these interactions had occurred while all parties were actively being punished for unrelated crimes was seen as particularly cunning, because obviously only sophisticated criminals would choose to conspire while under official surveillance. The audacity of coordinating illegal activities during legal punishment was apparently evidence of criminal genius worthy of additional investigation and enhanced penalties. But the conspiracy theory created a new problem. If these citizens were working together, then their individual punishments might be insufficient to address their collective threat to social order. The magistrates huddled in emergency session to develop appropriate responses to organised crime that manifested as bread disasters, fashion violations, and excessive cleanliness. Meanwhile, the animals had apparently decided to escalate their own contributions to the day's festivities. The pig that had been executed for stepping on the priest's foot was replaced by a new pig, who immediately committed the crime of looking suspicious while eating slop. The rooster that had been chained for incorrect crowing was joined by a second rooster, who crowed in what the animal inspector declared to be solidarity with criminal behaviour. Even the rats had organised themselves into what appeared to be a coordinated cheese theft operation. Multiple witnesses reported seeing groups of rats moving in formation toward the market stalls, suggesting a level of criminal planning that surpassed even human conspiracy theories. The rat trials were immediately expanded to include charges of organised rodent resistance and unlawful assembly, with intent to steal dairy products. The pigeons had achieved something approaching military organisation. They had apparently established a command structure, with senior pigeons directing junior pigeons in precision, bombing runs against specific targets. The pigeon management specialist, another newly created position, reported that the birds were demonstrating suspicious intelligence and coordinated defecation patterns that suggest training or supernatural guidance. This led to the unprecedented decision to put the pigeons on trial for conspiracy, which required the construction of tiny defendant stands and the appointment of a special prosecutor who specialised in avian crime. The lead pigeon was formally charged with commanding an aerial assault unit and organising biological warfare against civic punishment procedures. The pigeon trial attracted even more spectators than the human punishments, because apparently nothing drew a crowd like watching someone attempt to cross-examine a bird about its motivations for strategic pooping. Children placed bets on whether the pigeon would plead guilty, fly away, or simply defecate on the prosecutor as a form of legal response. But the day's crowning achievement in bureaucratic creativity came when the various inspectors realised they had been working in isolation and needed to coordinate their efforts to address the growing complexity of overlapping crimes and punishments. This led to the formation of the Integrated Punishment Coordination Committee, whose job was to ensure that multiple simultaneous punishments didn't accidentally interfere with each other. The committee's first major challenge was determining whether Pierre's bread crimes took precedence over Lisbeth's fashion violations when their punishments intersected. Did flour contamination of illegal purple fabric constitute a bread crime that happened to involve clothing, or a fashion crime that happened to involve baked goods? The legal implications were staggering. After extensive deliberation involving multiple inspectors, 3 magistrates, and a consultant who claimed expertise in cross-categorical crime classification, they determined that flour-dusted purple fabric represented an entirely new category of offence, mixed medium aesthetic crimes with food contamination elements. This required the creation of a new punishment that addressed both the bread and fashion aspects, while ensuring appropriate educational value for spectators. The solution was elegant in its complexity. Pierre and Lisbeth were chained together and required to parade through the square while carrying samples of contaminated evidence and reciting alternating verses of a specially composed song about the dangers of allowing bread crimes and fashion crimes to interact without proper supervision. The song, written by a committee of inspectors who had apparently missed their calling as either poets or torturers, included memorable lyrics like, "When bread meets purple in the square of shame, both flour and fabric bear the mark of blame," and "Let this lesson echo through the town, coordination of crimes brings justice down." Marjorie and Hubert were similarly paired in what the committee called hygiene emotion coordination therapy, where Marjorie's excessive cleanliness was balanced against Hubert's mandatory crying to create what the inspectors described as optimal moisture levels for moral instruction. They were required to work together to maintain precisely calibrated levels of dampness through coordinated scrubbing and weeping. Joren and Ansel formed the Competence Misfortune Management Unit, where Joren's sleep-deprived hallucinations were guided by Ansel's strategic bad luck to create educational scenarios about the dangers of both excessive skill and insufficient control over one's circumstances. They stumbled through the square in a carefully choreographed dance of managed incompetence and supervised accidents. The committee had essentially created a human puzzle, where each person's punishment was designed to complement and enhance the others, resulting in a kind of performance art where suffering was optimized through collaborative coordination. It was bureaucracy elevated to the level of experimental theatre, with the entire town serving as both stage and audience. The crowd had grown to include visitors from neighbouring villages, travelling merchants, and at least one scholar who was frantically taking notes for what he claimed would be a definitive study of applied punishment theory and practice. Food vendors had set up permanent stalls to serve the audience, creating a festival atmosphere around institutionalized suffering that would have impressed even the most creative Roman emperors. Children had organized betting pools on various aspects of the ongoing punishments. Who would collapse first? Which inspector would discover the next conspiracy? Whether the pigeons would successfully coordinate a mass escape, and which combination of crimes would be invented next? The local economy was apparently thriving on the entertainment value of comprehensive civic dysfunction. But the committee's masterpiece was yet to come. As darkness began to fall, they announced the creation of the grand finale Punishment Coordination Spectacular, a comprehensive evening performance that would demonstrate the proper integration of all discovered crimes, conspiracies, and corrective measures in a single unified display of educational entertainment. All citizens were required to attend, either as participants in ongoing punishments or as witnesses responsible for learning appropriate lessons about the consequences of bread crimes, fashion violations, excessive cleanliness, emotional irregularities, supernatural competence, suspicious bad luck, and conspiracy to commit coordinated chaos. The square was illuminated with torches arranged in patterns designed to optimize viewing angles for maximum educational impact. Musicians were recruited to provide accompaniment, though they were warned that any music that made the punishment seem entertaining rather than instructive would result in immediate fines for encouraging dangerous emotional responses to justice. The evening's program included synchronized punishment demonstrations, coordinated confession recitations, group apologies for conspiracy participation, and a special ceremony where the various animals would be formally inducted into the legal system as full participants in the town's justice procedures. The pigeons were to be sworn in as official aerial enforcement units with tiny badges and formal recognition of their contributions to punishment delivery systems. The pigs received honorary appointments as ground-based accident demonstration specialists, while the rats were designated as official evidence disposal coordinators, responsible for eliminating any physical evidence that might interfere with retroactive law enforcement. The rats seemed particularly pleased with their new status, immediately beginning what appeared to be a victory celebration that involved coordinated cheese acquisition from unguarded market stalls. The fact that they were simultaneously being honoured for their service and committing new crimes while receiving recognition created a delightful recursive loop of justice that the inspectors found deeply satisfying. As the torches flickered and the crowd settled in for the evening's entertainment, it became clear that what had started as routine law enforcement had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of municipal governance. The town had accidentally created a self-sustaining system of creative punishment that generated its own entertainment, educational content, and economic activity, while providing meaningful employment for an ever-expanding bureaucracy of specialized inspectors. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for citizens to accidentally violate regulations they didn't know existed, creating fresh material for the punishment coordination system to process and transform into public spectacle. The cycle would continue, each day building on the innovations of the previous day, until the entire concept of normal life had been replaced by an elaborate performance where everyone was simultaneously criminal, victim, enforcer, and audience member. And in that moment, as Pierre struggled with his bread burden while chained to Lisbeth and her purple scarf, as Marjorie scrubbed in perfect coordination with Hubert's tears, as Joran hallucinated his way through Ansel's carefully managed accidents, and as the pigeons circled overhead in formation while the rats celebrated their promotion to official status, the town had achieved something remarkable, a perfect synthesis of justice, entertainment, and administrative efficiency that would have made bureaucrats weep with joy if weeping hadn't been regulated and required specific permits. The medieval world had found its rhythm, and that rhythm was the sound of comprehensive, coordinated, creatively managed suffering set to music and performed under torchlight for the education and entertainment of all. It was, in its own twisted way, a kind of masterpiece. The grand finale punishment coordination spectacular was everything the committee had promised, and several things they hadn't anticipated, as the torches cast dancing shadows across the square, transforming ordinary cobblestones into a stage worthy of the gods of chaos themselves. The citizens of this medieval town prepared to witness what would later be remembered as either the pinnacle of administrative achievement or the moment civilization finally gave up and decided to become performance art instead. The evening began with what the committee had grandly titled the Procession of Coordinated Acknowledgement, where each punishment pair would parade through the square while demonstrating their specialized forms of coordinated suffering. Pierre and Lisbeth led the procession, their chain clanking rhythmically as they balanced illegal bread samples and contaminated purple fabric while reciting their assigned verses about cross-categorical crime dangers. Behind them, Marjorie and Hubert performed their moisture coordination routine with the precision of dancers who had trained for years, instead of citizens who had been chained together that afternoon. Marjorie's scrubbing motions synchronized perfectly with Hubert's tear production, creating what the committee proudly declared to be optimal humidity distribution for maximum moral impact. Joran and Ansel brought up the rear in their competence-misfortune partnership, with Joran's sleep-deprived stumbling perfectly timed to trigger Ansel's strategic accidents. They moved through the square like a two-person disaster machine, carefully calibrated to demonstrate the precise balance between excessive skill and insufficient luck that the inspectors had determined to be most educationally valuable. The crowd had swelled to proportions that suggested news of the evening's entertainment had spread far beyond the town boundaries. Merchants from distant villages had arrived with wagons full of snacks, beverages, and small souvenirs commemorating what was already being called the Night of Perfect Justice. Children from neighbouring settlements had convinced their parents to make the journey, arguing that witnessing coordinated punishment art was obviously more educational than any regular evening activities. But the committee's masterstroke was the integration of the animal justice system into the human punishment matrix. The newly appointed official aerial enforcement units, formerly known as pigeons, had been fitted with tiny ceremonial badges and were performing coordinated flyovers of the punishment procession. Their precision was remarkable, with each bird delivering its contribution to the proceedings at precisely timed intervals that suggested either extensive training or supernatural guidance. The lead enforcement pigeon, wearing a badge that was proportionally larger than those of its subordinates, had positioned itself atop the ceremonial judgment pole, where it surveyed the proceedings with what observers described as professional satisfaction. When it occasionally cooed, the other pigeons immediately adjusted their formations, creating aerial patterns that spelled out words like justice and coordination in the evening sky. The ground-based accident demonstration specialists, previously known as pigs, had been arranged around the square's perimeter where they performed carefully choreographed stumbling routines designed to illustrate the consequences of insufficient attention to proper walking techniques. Each pig wore a small sign indicating its specialized area of expertise: foot placement errors, momentum management failures, and spatial awareness violations. The official evidence disposal coordinators, still technically rats but now with formal recognition of their contributions to the justice system, had organized themselves into what appeared to be a synchronized cheese acquisition demonstration. They moved through the market stalls in formations that suggested extensive planning, collecting evidence of merchant compliance with proper food storage regulations, while simultaneously testing the effectiveness of anti-theft measures. The committee had thoughtfully provided commentary throughout the evening's proceedings, with various inspectors taking turns explaining the educational significance of each coordinated punishment demonstration. The bread inspector delivered a detailed lecture on the relationship between flour distribution and social order, while the fashion inspector provided insights into colour theory as applied to civic compliance. The hygiene inspector's presentation on moisture management in public correction procedures was particularly well received, especially when illustrated by Marjorie and Hubert's real-time demonstration of optimal dampness coordination. The audience took careful notes, apparently recognising the practical value of understanding proper wet-to-dry ratios in their own potential future punishment scenarios. But the evening's true innovation was the introduction of what the committee called audience participation justice, where spectators were invited to contribute to the educational experience by identifying potential regulatory violations among their fellow audience members. This created a delightful recursive layer where people watching punishments could simultaneously be evaluated for punishment-worthy behaviour while engaging in the justice process as active participants rather than passive observers. Children proved particularly enthusiastic about this aspect of the proceedings, eagerly pointing out instances of excessive enjoyment of suffering, inappropriate laughter during moral instruction, and insufficient attention to educational content. Their parents, initially concerned about encouraging such behaviour, quickly realised that teaching children to identify regulatory violations early would serve them well in their own future interactions with the inspection system. The conspiracy detection specialist had positioned himself strategically to observe both the official proceedings and the audience participation elements, watching for signs of coordinated resistance to the evening's educational objectives. He was particularly interested in patterns of synchronized laughter, coordinated food consumption, and suspiciously similar reactions to various punishment demonstrations. And there you have it, dear viewers, the Middle Ages in all their gloriously dysfunctional splendour, where simply existing was a crime, and every breath you took could potentially violate 17 different regulations you'd never heard of. We've witnessed Pierre's criminal bread empire, Lisbeth's purple scarf conspiracy, Marjorie's dangerous cleanliness, Brother Hubert's inadequate tears, and poor Ansel's weaponized bad luck, all orchestrated by a bureaucracy so creatively insane it would make modern red tape weep with envy. What strikes me most about this medieval madness isn't just the absurdity of the laws themselves, but how eagerly everyone participated in this theatre of suffering. The inspectors finding new ways to criminalise breathing, the children placing bets on which neighbour would collapse first, even the pigeons organising themselves into aerial enforcement units. It was a society that had transformed human misery into entertainment, bureaucracy into art, and justice into a circus where everyone was simultaneously the performer and the audience. Next time you think modern life is complicated, remember that you live in an age where smiling doesn't require permits. Bread can be whatever size you want, and your clothes won't land you in stocks for crimes against fashion. Though honestly, given how things are going, maybe don't get too comfortable with that assumption. If you enjoyed watching me dissect this particular slice of historical insanity, hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into humanity's most spectacularly broken moments. And drop a comment letting me know which medieval punishment you think you'd have been most likely to face. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another era that proves humans have always been absolutely terrible at being reasonable about literally anything.